In this video, I'm going to cover a particular type of question that is usually on the provincial exam. In this transformation, I want you to find 1 over f of x where f of x is given. So go ahead and copy down these graphs on a separate piece of paper somewhere. I'm going to go through the solutions on how to graph something like this with you. Okay, so if we want to graph 1 over f of x, essentially, if I want to write out the transformation as points, this is going to be xy, but change to x 1 over y, which means my x values are all going to stay the same, but it's my y values that are going to change. It's actually going to be reciprocated as 1 over that. So here are some tips that you should consider when you graph your 1 over f of x graph. All points on the x-axis, or in other words, your y value is equal to 0, are going to create asymptotes. And this should make sense because we can't divide by 0. So if y is 0, I'm going to do 1 over 0, and that is a problem. So you're going to create asymptotes there. Another thing, y equals 1 points are going to be the same. And again, this should make sense because 1 over 1 is 1. So y equals 1 is going to be the same, as well as y equals negative 1, because if I do 1 divided by negative 1, I still get back negative 1. Arms pointing towards infinity. If I take the reciprocal of that, I do 1 over a really large number, it's going to become really small. So arms pointing towards infinity are now going to point towards our x-axis, or approach it. Again, this is because if I reciprocate a really large number, I'm going to get a really small number, so small that it'll be closer and closer and closer to 0. And the other way around, arms that were originally pointing towards the x-axis, or approaches the x-axis, let's say approaching instead of pointing here, will now approach infinity. And again, because if we have 1 over a tiny number, it becomes really large and become infinitely big if we keep doing that. So I'm going to use these 4 little points to help me find the graph of 1 over f of x. So all points on the x-axis are going to create asymptotes. So I have 1 point over here that crosses the x-axis. That means that I'm going to create a vertical asymptote here. And if you want to add a note, you can say this creates the vertical asymptote. The next point, it says y equals 1 are going to be the same. So I have quite a few points along y equals 1. This whole arm then is then going to be the same. Same with y equals negative 1. Then lastly, it says arm pointing towards infinity. We don't have any arms pointing towards infinity in this case. It's just going straight at y equals 1 or y equals negative 1, so we don't need to worry about that point. But arms approaching the x-axis now approach infinity. So these parts here are getting closer and closer to 0. That means if I reciprocate this, it's now going to approach infinity instead. So it's going to hug a vertical asymptote. These were positive numbers, The ones in here were positive numbers, which is why I'm going to approach positive infinity. Versus the other one, these are negative numbers, and if I reciprocate negative numbers, I'm going to get really large negative numbers instead, which is why I'm going to approach towards negative infinity here. Okay, so this black part is our final answer, black part of this graph. You can color in different color if it's easier to see. I'll do it in pink if you want. So this part here is our new graph. Moving on to the next one. Follow the same 4 points. So all points on the x-axis are going to create vertical asymptotes. We have 1 point here. That means I'm going to create a vertical asymptote here. Next thing, all y equals 1 points are going to be the same as well as y equals -1. So these 2 points are going to remain the same. Now it says arm pointing towards infinity, which is over here. Now it should approach the x-axis. Okay, so my arm that used to be here is actually going to approach our x-axis instead. Remember, your x values remain the same, it's just your y values that are changing. And it says arm points towards infinity are going to approach the x-axis. We have another one over here. It's approaching negative infinity. So that means it's going to approach the x-axis now. Then lastly, in here, we have really small numbers, and if I take the reciprocal of that, I'm going to get really large numbers, so those are going to point towards infinity. So the light purplish pink part of what we just drew, this is our new graph of 1 over f of x. In general, you should always follow these rules. So you could find 1 over f of x. These rules will always apply. This part is the most confusing though. These arms pointing towards infinity now approach the x-axis, the x-axis are now approaching infinity. All you do is like swapping the direction of the arms. That's all you're doing really. So this part here, instead of approaching 0, I'm just going to approach infinity. And in here, this was approaching infinity. Now I'm going to make sure it's approaching 0, the x-axis.